Hey everyone. Alrighty, well, good to be back with you. Happy Tuesday. Kind of a very warm, um, overcast, cloudy, kind of dark day here in southern Ohio. Could be a lot worse. It should be like around 20 degrees or something, but it's all like 63 degrees today, so it's kind of unusual. It's a very warm day, kind of rainy day, cloudy, windy. That's okay. Hopefully, you all are doing well and your weather is fine. So, as I mentioned yesterday, we are going to begin. I'm going to begin doing a few videos this week that should take us through the end of the week and dig in a little bit to this relationship between the United States and Iran so that we can better understand our relationship with Iran, where it began, and how we got to where we are today. So, I titled this video uh, and the videos that will follow America and Iran, the history. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, to really understand the history between the United States and Iran, we really need to go back to the World War One, and mainly we need to look at the relationship that developed between the British government and Iran at that time, because the major event that really got us off onto a bad track with the Iranians was an operation that involved our relationship, our friendship with the British government. So let's take a trip back in time to the year 1901. Very significant year. In the year 1901, there was a British businessman who was interested in oil exploration. And he found himself in Iran, where he believed he would find some oil. At the time, the ruler of Iran was a Shah. A Shah as in like S-H-A-H, Shah. Meaning he was essentially a monarch, a dictator, a king, essentially. And this was the first Shah there. Now, this British businessman went to the Shah and he told him that he wanted to, explore for oil and find this oil and then extract this oil, refine this oil, and put it onto the market. So he and the Shah signed a 60-year deal. And in this deal, the British businessman would do all of the work, primarily because, of course, the Iranians at this point, 1901, had no ability to do any of this stuff. They just happened to be sitting on all this oil. They had no real way of extracting it or finding it. So this British businessman began this process. And as part of this deal, the British businessman would do all the excavation for the oil, finding the oil, getting the oil to market, and he would just cut a clear 16% off the top, and that would be paid to the Shah. 16%. Now, you would think that this money, which would generate quite a bit of revenue, would be shared with the people in Iran. But like most shahs, monarchs, and kings in these Middle Eastern countries, that did not happen. Most of the money ended up into the personal bank account of the Shah. So his people remained fairly poor while he got fabulously wealthy off of this oil from the 16% that he was getting raked off the top. So by 1909, this British businessman had successfully located the oil, had extracted it from the ground, had refined it, and was producing it, exporting it, and he was in business. He set up the company at that point in 1909 and began calling the company the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. This company would later become BP, British Petroleum. Now, this takes us to the year 1914. Now, this is a very significant time period between 1900 and 1920 for the Middle Eastern nations who had oil. So specifically what happened in 1914 was that the British government realized that World War I was on, and they were going to be in it. But more significantly, the British Navy had recently undergone the process of moving from a navy that operated on coal power to a navy that operated on petroleum. Also, you had the introduction of the airplane, and of course all the other types of vehicles that are used in by militaries, and they were going to be using petroleum. So the British government realized in 1914 that they were going to be needing a lot of petroleum, and they began looking for the place to get this petroleum. So they understood that they had this British businessman who had already signed a deal with the Iranians, specifically the Shah, and that he was in fact pulling oil out of Iran, and therefore it became obvious to the British government what they needed to do. So what they did was they invested $2.2 million into the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which gave them 51% ownership of that company, therefore de facto nationalizing the Anglo-Persian Oil Company and essentially making the British government the majority owners of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And this was a very smart move, because once the war got started and the British entered the war, they had secured all the petroleum needs that they had to power their Navy, their Army, their Air Force, and just the general petroleum needs that countries were having based on this new move into petroleum and away from coal. So this was a very smart move on the part of the British government. Now this process continued throughout the next 20 years or so, as more and more Western nations made the move from coal-powered vehicles and things and ships and tanks or what have you into petroleum, away from coal into petroleum. So more and more countries were going to the place where the oil was, and that was the Middle East. So we saw, for example, we saw the United States. They found their Shah or their monarch or their king in the Middle East in Saudi Arabia. And so the United States began their relationship with oil production in Saudi Arabia. The French, of course, they found oil contracts to be had in Iran as well as Algeria. And of course, the Soviet Union found their oil partners in Iraq. So as we can see, during this period, as we moved to a more petroleum-based situation, countries were moving and going to the places where that petroleum was, and that was the Middle East. And so they were all signing similar types of contracts. Remember, these Middle Eastern countries really didn't have the technology or the know-how to find this oil and extract it and produce it and export it. So they weren't being paid very much for their oil. And what money was being paid to these monarchs and shahs and kings and people like that, they were pocketing the money for themselves and not really sharing it with their citizens. So even though these monarchs and these shahs and kings were getting fabulously wealthy, and the Western companies or large powers were securing their petroleum needs and they were making a lot of money as well, the people in these Middle Eastern countries were being left behind. Also, we have to keep in mind that as part of these deals, as these Middle Eastern countries were now becoming important factors because of their petroleum, their infrastructure was needing to be built. And so it was also these Western companies who were coming in and building the infrastructure into these Middle Eastern countries. So they were, but they were having to pay to have that done. And that was costing them a lot of money. It was cutting into those profits, which were not very high. Remember, the original deal with the Iranians and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, 16%. And these were the similar types of numbers that most other countries were getting. So this is the situation that took us up through just about the end of World War II. Now, after World War II, right after World War II, actually in the mid to late 40s, we began to see where a lot of these countries, which were oil-rich nations, were looking at the deals that they had cut and realizing that they weren't getting very much of the profit from the oil, and they were realizing that a lot of the benefit from the infrastructure building was not really going to them. It was going to the same people who were extracting the oil and making all that money as well. So a lot of these countries began to have an interest in renegotiating the deals that they had cut to try to get a larger percentage of those oil profits coming back to them. And the very first nation to do this in the late 40s was Venezuela. They renegotiated their deal and ended up getting a 50-50 split on oil profits. The Saudis followed right behind them, and they got a similar deal of a 50-50 type deal. So now these Middle Eastern countries were starting to wise up and realize the amount of money that was being made, and realizing how much money they were getting screwed out of, and they were now making a move to better their situation. And in the case of Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, they were successful. But over in Iran, that was not the case. So there was a man who came along, an Iranian politician. His name was Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh. He was a secular Democrat, a socialist, kind of like a typical European type socialist. He believed in a lot of big social programs, you know, free medical and all that kind of stuff, the type of thing you see in the socialist countries. But he was an Iranian. He wasn't a religious, you know, extremist. He was a kind of a secular. He was, I do believe he was Islamic, but he was fairly secular. He had a democratic outlook, and he wanted to bring reforms to Iran as well. And the bone in Mr. Mossadegh's throat was the fact that he realized that the deal that had been signed with the British government and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was not a good deal at all. And he realized that most of that oil wealth had gone into the pocket of the Shah and not had benefited the people in the country at all. So Mossadegh became a very popular politician in Iran by being the loudest voice in the country, calling for a renegotiation of those oil contracts, and also a plan to make sure that when those oil profits came in, that they were shared equally amongst the citizens of the country, and that a lot of that money would go to building infrastructure, improving the lives of ordinary everyday Iranians, allowing him to give them better services and more services. So he was your typical socialist who was looking to get a better deal from the oil revenues for the benefit of his country. But unfortunately, the British government was not the least bit interested. They had a fantastic deal, and they knew it, and they weren't interested on renegotiating. So there was a lot of squabbles and stuff that went on between the Iranian government and the British, but the British would never concede or back down. They took the hard line. They weren't going to renegotiate the deals at all. So eventually, the Iranians and Mohammad Mossadegh took the issue to the international courts. The international courts ruled in the favor of the Iranian government, but the British government just simply ignored that, which of course led Mohammad Mossadegh to now start calling for an actual nationalization of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, to essentially just take it over and kick the British out, which is exactly what he did. And this, of course, was a very good move for him politically. It made him very popular. In fact, it resulted in him becoming prime minister. So now Mohammad Mossadegh is the prime minister. He's booted the British out of the country. He's now taking over the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, and now they're keeping all those profits for themselves. Well, this didn't go on very long before the British government realized that they had to do something about that. They weren't very happy. So they looked at some military options, but didn't like basically what they saw there. So they decided to go see if they could enlist the help of their good friend, the United States. At that time, President Truman was the president, and when he was pitched by the British government on their dilemma, he decided he wanted to distance himself from it. He didn't want to get involved in it. There was nothing really in it for him. And as far as he was concerned, it could create a situation in his mind that maybe he could get drawn into a war with the Soviet Union over this conflict. And he didn't want that to happen. Truman just really didn't want any part of it. So the British government went back home and they thought of some other ideas. So they got together with some other oil companies, competitors, as well as some other wealthy industrialists, and they came up with a plan to blockade, because they couldn't really legally sanction, because they couldn't get enough people on board to do it. But they decided that working with these private interest competitors, that they could institute a blockade and prevent Iran from being able to export this oil and get the profits. And they were fairly successful in doing that. The problem was, it wasn't solving their original problem. They still weren't benefiting from the oil revenues. They weren't getting their company back. They were just preventing the Iranians and hurting them, which they were. This did have a very severe impact on Iran. They were finding it very, very difficult to export that oil, and so they were taking a very heavy hit as well. So there was pain on both sides, and there was no clear resolution in sight. Okay, so this takes us now up to 1952. And in 1952, we had a presidential election. And the new president was General Eisenhower, who had been, of course, the supreme commander in World War II. So Eisenhower comes into office. And once Eisenhower comes into office, the British, still dealing with their major issue over in Iran, decided that they would come back to the United States and have a talk with the new president, to see if maybe they could persuade him to give them some assistance in taking back their oil company in Iran. Okay, so that's quite a bit of information that we've covered right there, and I want to keep the videos a little shorter. Don't want to give you too much information all at once. I just want you to kind of sit back and soak all that in for a little while and kind of get a picture in your mind and a feeling for what was happening at this particular time, and in 1950, 51, 52, as these things were coming to a head, and realizing that we were entering into a new Cold War period, and that economies were growing. More and more needs for petroleum was being realized by a lot of these countries, not just Western countries, but the Soviet Union and other countries as well. Petroleum was becoming a major national security issue, and of course most of that petroleum was coming out of a region of the world which is very unstable. And so it is all these things, as well as we now have a clash of civilizations, a clash of cultures, because now with these Western countries being in the Middle East, there was also an influx of Western culture and Western values that were slowly being seeping into this area of the world, which was, primarily Iran, 90% Muslim. Iran is, the Iranians are not Arabs, by the way, they're Persians. Iran is essentially Persia. It became Iran, but it used to be called Persia for 3,000 years. And the makeup of Iran is that it's about 45% Persian, it's about 20% Kurds, Kurdistan people. You also have about 10% Arabs. You also have Christians and Jews and other more tribal type Arab people there as well. So it's a fairly multifaceted cultural and religious country, but 90% of the people in Iran are Islamic, and they had a period of secularism under the Shah, which westernized them to a great extent, which is part of the problem and partly what led to the revolution. But just so you know the cultural and religious makeup of Iran, because it's going to be important as we move forward. So that's where we are. It's now 1950, 52. Eisenhower's been elected. The British and the Iranian government are in a standoff over the oil company situation, and things are about to change. So we'll pick that up tomorrow, and we'll talk about what happened once General Eisenhower became president and how that situation began to escalate and move forward. Alrighty, y'all have a good day. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up, a like, share it with your friends, subscribe, if I can talk. And I'll be back tomorrow, and we'll pick it up from where we left off today, and we'll see what happens next. Alrighty? Y'all have a good day. Bye.